First one, I'm concerned about the issue you brought up with regard to the labor situation in the early days with Firestone and the Fernando Po incident. The Firestone, it seems, indirectly...
Excuse me, can you please carry the microphone closer to you?
Yeah. Testing, is that okay? Good. It seems that Firestone indirectly short-circuited our national resolve for self-reliance in a sense by corrupting the government officials and then gradually leading to a situation of, instead of creative development, a sort of subservient level of labor. So I'm trying to understand now, because when you made your statement, there was a connection that Firestone was paying a very small amount in a sense for people, but at the same time the issue of the Fernando Po crisis brought up a similar labor issue where people were to be hired and paid for the services that they rendered, that they, etc. So what I'm trying to understand is, how did this Fernando Po crisis become a crime in a sense, in that people were paid for a service, especially when I consider what happened, for example, in countries like Korea and other countries where cheap labor was exported in Korea, particularly to Germany. And the Germans paid that money, and the money was used to help develop Korea today by the leaders in those days. So I'm trying to get your perspective on the difference of our labor situation, how it short-circuited our creative development as compared to it being useful for us. So could you shed light on something of that nature?
Thank you. Well, in your own analysis, you can compare Korea with Liberia today and see whether anything benefited us. Firestone did not corrupt the officials.
Okay.
Because the officials had the official responsibility and personal responsibility not to be corrupt, to serve their country. Because you're always having temptation coming. Business people. I'm not saying it is the character of business to be corrupt. But the temptations are always coming. It is left with the government official, mindful of their sacred responsibilities and duties, and moral commitment to their citizens, not to accept that temptation. So Firestone didn't corrupt the officials. And mind you, these were very senior officials, starting from the president down to a senator, representing the people, introducing that bill in the legislature concurrently, simultaneously being retained as a lawyer by the company. It was a conflict of interest, glaring display. The question of labor, it was like the tail of the spider. My grandmother explained to me how spider is drawn in a little first grade book, how spider got small waist. And the story goes like this, that they always portray spider as a very greedy symbol. Spider was invited by 2 towns in opposite directions to the feast, big feast, and he got very excited. And the time wasn't too far from each other. One was having the lunch at 12 and the other one was like 1:30. And the distance was a little bit far. But he thought that he could make it at both places. And so he asked the first town that they should hold the end of a rope that he tied around his waist and said, when the time is ready, you should pull me. Then I'll come so we can have the festivities, so we can eat. Then he went to the opposite town and he gave them the other end of the rope without telling them that the other end of the rope had been given to the first town. So they also agreed to pull him whenever they were ready to eat. And so the 2 towns got ready simultaneously, opposite direction. They started holding the rope, and the rope was around his waist. Before that, he had a very fat body, so he couldn't go to any of the feast. Ended up being hungry, and then his waist got smaller. The government signed an agreement, the government and President King, to supply labor that Firestone even said should have been around 350,000, which was roughly the population then. With Firestone to supply labor. And then later on, they made an arrangement, the other side of the spider rope, to supply labor to the fields of Fernando Po of the Central African coast. So the festivities were ready at the same time. And the government had a rope around itself and gave the two ends to two groups that needed labor. And mind you, the third group was the regular supply of labor to the commissioner to carry on his work. District commissioner appointed by the president. So by force, people had to go and do plotter work, they call it those days. So you had three groups demanding labor. This labor supply that appears that it cannot be depleted. Then the other factor is what kind of compensation was being given. Many of those who were taken from there didn't know how much they were going to receive. They were given very little, but the commissioner had to make arrangement with the chiefs and give them something very little. So for the whole year, for example, a laborer at Firestone got $1.50 the whole year per head, per year. So that was exploitation, obviously. But it was your government that went into that agreement. And they were not going to send anybody else besides people from the interior. The same people that they had not recognized as citizens, whose culture they didn't assume had any value to the emerging democracy. But they were only useful for labor. This is similar to the experience under colonialism. When the French and the British came, they colonized, balkanized the territories. They had two different approaches, but with a common end. The French said, the British said, look, we're not going to pretend that we want to make you British citizens. No, you are subjects here in Africa. The French said, oh no, you can be a French person, but you know what? You have to be educated. You have to learn French and be an elite. But you know what happened? When the war came, they had to fight. They had to fight the Algerian war. They had to fight all around. The same people that the British said had nothing to do with their leadership, their rule, etc. And this caveat that the French had, that you had to be educated in French culture, etc., before you can be French citizen, the war made them to automatically grab a lot of Africans to carry them. One of them said, I can't speak French. He said, oh, forget about it. We're going to put away that particular requirement. So here was a scenario. These people were not considered as Liberians, even though the government had some sort of control over them in terms of administration and jurisdiction. And so, clearly, this was exploitation.
But you would say that this type of exploitation was in harmony, you say, with the chiefs? The chiefs got a certain payment and they sort of mobilized the people?
They were conniving. We didn't come here to defend what is wrong, no matter who is behind it. They were conniving, you know. And the other area was the land, because Firestone had to take 1 million acres. Of course, they didn't take a million acres right away. But what were the arrangements, legal arrangements, to have the people removed from the land? That didn't go down too well. And by the way, this is not an indictment of Firestone. I just use it as a case study to try to show what we were doing as Liberians to ourselves. So basically, yes, there was connivance
Okay.
between some of those people and government.
Would you say that there's a big difference between what happened then at the rate of $1 something cents per year when you consider the value of money then, and the current rate that is being paid laborers at Firestone this year? Would there be such a big difference from the exploitation factor?
Well, $1.50 for a whole year. I don't know what is being paid now. But even then, those who are living, including the Christie report, the League of Nations Commission that was set up, they consider that as exploitation.